This week's slump in asset manager stocks was driven by private credit fears. Here's what's worrying investors. Written by Christine Idzelis, published by MarketWatch. Shares of asset managers faced serious selling pressure this past week after worries over a private credit fund managed by Blue Owl Capital triggered broader investor anxiety about spillover effects. Blue Owl's shares are down 4.8%, which saw a big drop Friday, deepening their weekly losses to around 12%, according to FactSet data. Shares of other asset managers that provide exposure to private credit businesses, often through business development companies, also known as BDCs, were also down for the week, including those of Ares Management, negative 5.15%, Blackstone, negative 3.57%, Apollo Global Management, up 1.17%, and KKR & Co., down 0.45%. Shares of these asset managers have been sliding for months due to concerns about their underwriting standards, but a recent sell-off in shares of software companies has helped to amplify concerns, as many of these firms have lent heavily to companies in the software space. Investor confidence in private credit received a jolt this past week with the news that Blue Owl was halting redemptions from its Blue Owl Capital Core, a fund that leads to mid-sized companies in the U.S. That sparked broader fears over potential trouble brewing in the portfolios of other private debt funds and BDCs, and concerns that firms may tighten restrictions on individual investors who want to get out of them. The debate right now is it more of a company-specific episode, or is this something emblematic of the industry and a sort of canary in the coal mine, said Jimmy Chang, Chief Investment Officer for Rockefeller Global Family Office, in an interview. With the case of Blue Owl, certainly there's a lot of focus on their lending to software companies, as that sector risks being disrupted by artificial intelligence, he noted. But Chang added that investors also are focusing on the structures of BDCs, some of which are listed on stock exchanges and trade daily, even though the private loans in their portfolio do not. BDCs typically lend to small and mid-sized private businesses. It's not a liquid market, he said. That poses a potential risk for investors, as the asset managers of BDCs may need to sell loans they hold in their portfolios to meet sudden redemption requests, Chang explained. And when loans become difficult to offload, managers may need to sell them at a discount or decide to halt withdrawals, a process known as gating. BDCs may fall under pressure as a result, putting investor capital at risk. Some individual investors may now be waking up to the risks associated with packaging private loans into publicly traded vehicles, something which is a liquidity mismatch, said Samir Samana, head of global equities and real assets at Wells Fargo Investment Institute, in a phone interview. The recent slump in exchange-traded funds that provide exposure to BDCs reflect worries over cracks in the industry. Shares of the VanEck BDC Income ETF were down negative 0.3%, whose top three holdings as recently as February 19th were Ares Capital Core, up 1.06%, Blue Owl Capital Core, up 0.35%, and Blackstone Secured Lending Fund, down 0.84%, ended Friday with a 1.9% weekly loss. The ETF has tumbled more than 25% over the past 12 months, according to FactSet data. The VanEck BDC Income ETF's holdings also include FSKKR Capital Core, down 1.44%, a BDC that's a partnership between Future Standard and KKR. While some of the large alternative asset managers whose shares sold off this past week are involved in publicly traded business development companies, Apollo's BDC is not listed on an exchange. Also, while most BDCs target middle market lending, the Apollo Debt Solutions BDC predominantly focuses on larger deals, according to the asset manager's website. Private credit has grown so much, noted Chang. Private equity giants such as Blackstone, Apollo, and KKR have helped fuel that growth by building out their private credit businesses. Many private equity deals are funded with private credit. As large asset managers were swept up in private debt fears, Apollo Global's shares slumped more than 4% this past week. Blackstone dropped a steeper 6.6% on the week, while Ares Management had a weekly loss of 8%, according to FactSet data. There are various ways for individual investors to find exposure to private credit. The fund at the center of private credit redemption fears this past week, Blue Owl Capital Core 2, is not a publicly traded BDC. We are not halting investor liquidity in OBDC2, a Blue Owl spokesperson said in an emailed statement to MarketWatch. We are accelerating the return of capital. The firm's recent asset sale will, quote, return 30% of OBDC2 investors' capital at book value to shareholders equally on a pro rata basis, according to the Blue Owl statement. Quote, instead of resuming a 5% a quarter tender where only tendering investors get a small portion of their capital back, we are returning 6 times as much capital and returning it to all shareholders over the next 45 days. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent addressed the growth of private credit lending outside the banking system over the past decade while speaking at the Dallas Economic Club on Friday, noting that he is concerned with watching how the industry gets involved with the regulated financial system. Our job is to make sure that the regulated system is not affected by private credit, he said at the event, after pointing to the subprime mortgage crisis that triggered the global financial crisis almost 20 years ago. I hope that they've been prudent in their loan portfolios, Bessent said. We have the ability to peel back a curtain, he added. When you get a call that the Secretary of the Treasury wants to come and see you, you return the call. In the meantime, private credit managers might find some support from the fact that the U.S. economy has been expanding, even if its pace of growth slowed more than expected during the fourth quarter. Our read is that to have a real credit crisis, you probably need a recession, said Chang, adding that defaults tend to be higher in recessionary environment. Still, AI bubble and disruption fears in the U.S. stock market have collided with private credit, according to Anthony Saglambeni, chief market strategist at Ameriprise Financial. There's less visibility, and so less understanding, of the deals done in private credit and private equity, he said in an interview. Quote, I think you're starting to see investors become so concerned that redemptions for some of these strategies have started to pick up, Saglambeni said. But, he added, private credit doesn't seem like a systematic problem. Floriana giant tortoise reintroduced to Galapagos Islands after almost 200 years. Published by The Guardian. Giant tortoises, the life-giving engineers of remote small island ecosystems, are plotting over the Galapagos Islands of Floriana for the first time in more than 180 years. The Floriana giant tortoise, Chelonidae niger, a subspecies of the giant tortoise once found across the Galapagos, was driven to extinction in the 1840s by whalers who removed thousands from the volcanic island to provide a living larder during their hunting voyages. Remarkably, 158 giant tortoises descended from the Floriana subspecies have been returned to the island in a vital step for the largest ecological restoration project undertaken on the Pacific Ocean archipelago. A relic population of giant tortoises discovered on Wolf Volcano in the north of Isabella Island in 2008 were found to be descended in part from the Floriana population. Most of the Wolf Volcano tortoises had domed shells like those living on Isabella's other volcanoes to the south, but some had a saddleback-shaped carapace more typical of the tortoises that evolved on Floriana. A captive backbreeding program began in 2017, for which 23 hybrid tortoises most closely related to the Floriana subspecies were chosen to recreate it as genetically close to the original as possible. More than 600 hatchlings had been born by 2025, and several hundred grew large enough to be returned to their ancestral island. Males can reach nearly 1.5 meters, 5 feet, in length. Although whalers wiped out the Floriana tortoise, it ironically endured on Wolf Volcano because they also deposited live tortoises on other islands for safekeeping and sometimes tossed tortoise cargo overboard if they needed to lighten their load during their whaling missions. Floriana, the 6th largest island in the archipelago, was once home to a wealth of endemic life, including spectacular species such as the Floriana mockingbird and the Floriana racer snake. But the arrival of sailors, whalers, and then settlers brought invasive mammals, including rats and feral cats, that wiped out native fauna and flora, a pattern repeated on small islands across the world. When Charles Darwin reached Floriana in 1835, its giant tortoise population was in its death throes. Its reintroduction has been brought about by the Floriana Ecological Restoration Project, a partnership between the Galapagos National Park Directorate and a number of charities working closely with the island's 160 residents. An invasive species eradication program, which began in 2023 and has removed most of the rats and feral cats on the island, paved the way for the tortoise's return. The Galapagos rail has since been rediscovered on Floriana after not being recorded since Darwin's first visit, And there has been a resurgence in populations of ground finches and native geckos, lizards, and snails. Veronica Mora, a Floriana community representative, said of the tortoise's return, quote, "This moment marks an important step forward, a future where conservation and community well-being go hand in hand, because our livelihoods, from tourism to agriculture and fishing, depend on the health of this island," end quote. The island's farmers have also reported much improved harvests since rat numbers were drastically reduced. Giant tortoises are keystone species. Their grazing maintains open habitats, promoting the growth of native plants and creating conditions that benefit reptiles, invertebrates, and birds. They also distribute native seeds across the island as they roam. Habitats are the foundation for biodiversity, the home that allows species to move, live, and evolve naturally over time, said Rakhan Zawai, the executive director of the Charles Darwin Foundation. Giant tortoises are a critical part of this system by dispersing seeds, shaping vegetation, creating microhabitats such as their well-known wallows, and influencing how landscapes regenerate. They help rebuild ecological processes that many other species depend on. Hugo Mogollon, the chief executive of Galapagos Conservancy, said, quote, "By identifying tortoises on Wolf Volcano with Floriana ancestry and breeding their descendants, we are returning the species to its island in a form that closely reflects the original lineage, laying a critical scientific foundation for the restoration of Floriana's ecosystems and the future reintroduction of additional native species." The next phase of restoration will seek to return species including the Floriana mockingbird, the Floriana racer snake, the vegetarian finch, and the little vermilion flycatcher. Dr. Jen Jones, the chief executive of the Galapagos Conservation Trust, said it's a validation of the incredible efforts we've seen over the last 20 years from a whole ecosystem of conservation NGOs, local authorities, determined individual researchers, and community champions. Dozens of countries steer clear safety commitment in global AI pledge. Written by Peter Hayek, published by Politico. Brussels. Some 88 countries and regions, including the US, the UK, and the EU, on Saturday endorsed an India-led declaration on artificial intelligence with little commitment to keep the technology safe. While the countries in the declaration recognize the importance of security in AI systems, they failed to include any binding measures on how to keep the technology safe, limiting themselves mostly to voluntary or industry-led measures. India gained support for its push to democratize the technology, with a declaration calling to enhance the affordability of and access to AI resources. The text, published Saturday, showed little change compared to a draft declaration scooped by Politico on Monday. The declaration is the most tangible outcome of the 4th Artificial Intelligence Summit, which took place in the Indian megacity of New Delhi this week. The omission of AI safety emphasizes how the summit shifted from a safety focus during the first iteration in the UK in 2023 to a free-for-all trade fair now. The EU, the US, and the UK all signed the declaration, which is a success for the Indian hosts. Russia, an ally of India, also signed. Last year, both the US and the UK did not sign. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi successfully challenged the US-Chinese dominance in the AI space with his democratization push and a declaration that heavily emphasized the importance of wide-scale adoption of AI. Both the US and China didn't have their heads of state or government leaders present at the summit, all because of a collision with Chinese New Year and the launch of US President Donald Trump's Board of Peace. That left the spotlight to some who sided with India's challenge to US-China prominence, like United Nations boss Antonio Guterres, who said in his keynote that the future of AI should not be decided by a few billionaires. The AI declaration gave a boost to the often ignored open-source AI movement, which wants to make AI models publicly available to reuse and develop further. Open-source AI applications and other accessible AI approaches, where appropriate, and wide-scale diffusion of AI use cases can contribute to scalability, replicability, and adaptability of AI systems across sectors, the declaration said. Slovakia threatens to cut electricity to Ukraine over Russian oil spat. Posted by Al Jazeera, written by Al Jazeera staff, AP, and Reuters. The Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico has issued Ukraine a 2-day deadline to resume the pumping of Russian oil through its territory, threatening to cut off electricity to the war-torn country if this demand is not met. FICO issued his ultimatum to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Saturday, warning on X that he would ask state-owned company SEPS to halt emergency supplies of electricity if flows of Russian crude via the Soviet-era Druzhba pipeline crossing Ukraine are not resumed by Monday. Slovakia and neighboring Hungary, which have both remained dependent on Russian oil since the Kremlin launched its invasion of Ukraine almost 4 years ago, have become increasingly vocal in demanding Kiev resume deliveries through the pipeline, which was shut down after what Ukraine said was a Russian drone strike hit infrastructure in late January. The Slovak leader accused Zelensky of acting maliciously towards his country, alluding to Ukraine's earlier halting of Russian gas supplies after a 5-year-old transit agreement expired in January 1st, 2025, which he claimed was costing Slovakia damages of 500 million euros, about 589 million USD per year. Describing Zelensky's actions as unacceptable behavior, he said that his refusal to involve the Slovak Republic in the latest 90 billion euro, 105 billion USD, military loan for Ukraine had been absolutely correct. Slovakia is a major source of European electricity for Ukraine, needed as Russian attacks have damaged its grid. Energy sector experts say Slovakia provided 18% of record-setting Ukrainian electricity imports last month. Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic all oppose the interest-free European Union loan package, which was agreed to by the bloc's member states back in December to help Ukraine meet its military and economic needs over the coming 2 years. While the three nations opposed the package, which replaced a contentious plan to use frozen Russian assets that ran aground over legal concerns, a compromise was reached in which they did not block the initiative and were promised protection from any financial fallout. However, as tensions mounted over the interrupted supply of Russian oil this week, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban threatened on Friday to overturn December's deal by vetoing the EU loan package. Quote, as long as Ukraine blocks the Druzhba pipeline, Hungary will block the 90 billion euro Ukrainian war loan. We will not be pushed around, end quote, the Hungarian leader wrote on Facebook. Slovakia and Hungary both received a temporary exemption from an EU policy prohibiting imports of Russian oil over the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs slammed Slovakia and Hungary on Saturday for what it called their ultimatums and blackmail over energy issues, saying the two countries are playing into the hands of the aggressor being Russia. The ministry said that Ukraine had provided information on the damage that resulted from Russian attacks on the Druzhba pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia, and that repair work is underway. In the meantime, it said it also proposed alternative ways to resolve the issue of supplying non-Russian oil to these countries. Virginia State Senator pushes for water testing after 243 million gallon sewage spill in the Potomac River, written by Shannon Hecht, published by Virginia Mercury. After a decrepit pipe burst in Maryland last month and sent hundreds of millions of gallons of raw sewage spewing into the Potomac River, are Virginia lawmakers now urging the state's health department to take concrete steps to address the environmental disaster's potential health risks to residents. Quote, this one will trickle down over time, and I'm very worried about the contamination as it goes, end quote, Senator Richard Stewart, Republican King George, said in an interview Friday. The D.C. water system owns the pipe that broke in Montgomery County, Maryland, on January 19th and leaked over 243 million gallons of sewage into the waterway. The agency estimates it will take about 6 weeks for a temporary fix on the pipe and 9 months for a permanent solution. Meanwhile, the Virginia Department of Health has issued a recreational advisory for 72.5 miles of the Virginia coast along the river, urging people to avoid touching the water and to be cautious when preparing seafood harvested from the river. VDH has not issued any warnings for drinking water, and Maryland has issued a shellfish closure only for the Port Tobacco River region down to the Harry W. Nice Bridge. After one of his constituents asked VDH about potential contamination, Stewart said he was concerned to learn that the agency was not testing the water given the magnitude of the spill. VDH will not conduct water sampling. The agency does not operate a freshwater bacterial monitoring program for recreational waters, and the Potomac River falls under Maryland's jurisdiction for water quality oversight, VDH's February 14th letter read. Stewart then sent in his own letter to State Health Commissioner Dr. B. Cameron Webb. Virginians who fish, crab, boat, and recreate on the Potomac River deserve proactive protection and transparency, not a declaration that no testing will occur because another state holds primary authority, Stewart wrote to Webb on Wednesday. Furthermore, there are miles of creeks and tributaries branching off the Potomac River that are unquestionably Virginia waters, directly impacting the health of our marine resources and shoreline communities that I represent. By Friday, Stewart said the state's top environmental agency had taken preliminary steps to test state waters. I have since learned that Department of Environmental Quality is engaged, and they are doing sampling in various places. They were sampling on the edge, Stewart said Friday. I asked them if they would please go out into the channel and do various water columns to determine if it's on the top. The Virginia Department of Environmental Quality said in a statement that on Tuesday, the agency collected 25 surface water samples across a recreational advisory area from above the sewer line break to Potomac Creek in Stafford County. The results of those samples are pending. The agency also said VDH staff conducted a routine seawater sampling run for shellfish growing areas from Colonial Beach to the 301 Harry Nice Bridge, collecting 36 water samples in total. Based on their laboratory analyses, there were no elevated fecal coliform bacteria concentrations, with the vast majority of the samples at or below the detection limit for the test. VDH replied to Stewart on Wednesday in a letter obtained by the Mercury, "We will continue sharing information, including sample results between VDH, DEQ, Alex Renew, DC Water, MDE, and VDEM. VDH staff are also maintaining communication with seafood industry stakeholders and watermen to provide timely, accurate information." Lance Gregory, director of VDH's Office of Environmental Health Services, wrote. Gregory also said that the agency, in partnership with the Marine Advisory Board, developed a mapping resource that illustrates the spill's geographic scope relative to other productive waterways in the Commonwealth. This tool supports affected watermen in communicating clearly about the limited proximity of the incident to other harvesting areas and helps preserve confidence in Virginia seafood. The state's chief executive also weighed in on the disaster on Friday and said the state's drinking water is safe. "I'm encouraged that EPA and FEMA have begun coordinating with DC Water to respond to the sewage spill in the Potomac," Governor Abigail Spanberger said in a statement. "Amid the response, our state agencies are conducting water quality testing and monitoring the status of repairs. Our focus is on Virginians' health and safety. Virginians should know that the spill is not impacting our drinking water." Members of Virginia's congressional delegation, along with Maryland officials, have written to DC Water about their concerns over the health and environmental impacts of the spill. Still, Stewart is pushing for the state to do more. Maryland owns the Potomac, but a lot of people in Virginia make their livelihood on it, and we eat a lot of the seafood that comes out of it. It's a very productive river, despite how badly we treated it over the years, Stewart said. Conservation group Potomac Riverkeepers Network agrees with the senator that this extreme of a situation calls for different approaches on how to handle it. The historic sewage spill and the ongoing risk of intermittent overflows demands a departure from the status quo, said David Flores, the vice president of the Potomac Riverkeepers Network. Virginians deserve more, not less, water quality monitoring and long-term assessments to protect their safety in the Commonwealth's natural resources. This responsibility should not be deferred to another state. In tariff case, Supreme Court justices bicker over treating Trump and Biden differently. Written by Paul Bersabach, published by NBC News. Washington. Conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch pulled no punches in taking aim at his colleagues on the Supreme Court for a lack of consistency in approaching board assertions of presidential power made by Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Gorsuch was part of the 6-3 majority that struck down most of Trump's tariffs on Friday, but he wrote a separate 46-page opinion that chided several of his fellow justices over how they approached the case. His colleagues were effectively applying the same Supreme Court precedent differently under Trump than they did under Biden, he argued, writing, quote, "It is an interesting turn of events," end quote. His invective focused on a theory known as the Major Questions Doctrine, which adherents say bars sweeping presidential action not specifically authorized by Congress. The conservative majority court embraced the doctrine while Biden was in office to strike down broad plans, such as his effort to forgive student loan debt. But in ruling against Trump on tariffs Friday, the conservative majority splintered. Gorsuch, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and Chief Justice John Roberts were in the majority, finding in part that Trump's tariffs needed to go through Congress. 3 others, Justice Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh, and Samuel Alito, dissented. Quote, "It shows you how much internal dissension there is on the Supreme Court right now," end quote, said Robin Efron, a professor at Fordham University School of Law. Roberts' 21-page majority opinion reads as if he hoped it would attract 9 votes, she added, but instead it was a huge internal fail. Even some of the justices who agreed with the outcome did not sign on to the part of Roberts' opinion that sought to adopt the major questions doctrine in curbing Trump's tariffs, raising questions about how it will be applied in future cases. While the court's 3 liberals who backed Biden and criticized the major questions doctrine in past rulings were in the majority against Trump, they again did not embrace the theory. Gorsuch, who has wholeheartedly supported the major questions doctrine, pointed to his colleagues waffling on the issue in his opinion. Quote, "Past critics of the major questions doctrine do not object to its application in this case," end quote, he said in a reference to the liberal justices. Quote, "Still others have joined major questions decisions in the past dissent from today's application of the doctrine," end quote, he added, referring to the dissenting conservatives. Thomas, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and liberal Justice Elena Kagan all felt the need to respond to Gorsuch in their own opinions, which might be one reason why the court took months to decide the case. Kagan, for example, pushed back on the idea that she was quietly endorsing the major questions theory, notwithstanding her former criticism. Quote, "Given how strong his apparent desire for converts, I almost regret to inform him that I am not one," end quote, Kagan quipped in a footnote directed at Gorsuch. Jonathan Adler, a professor at William & Mary Law School, said Gorsuch's critique of Kagan had merit, saying it is hard to square her opinion on Friday with her previous votes. In one 2022 case in which the court ruled against Biden's attempts to tackle climate change, Kagan wrote that the major questions doctrine seemed to magically appear when it suited the conservative majority. But Ilya Somin, a professor at George Mason University's law school who joined the legal challenge to the tariffs, said the dissenting conservatives were just as guilty of contradicting themselves. In his opinion, Kavanaugh argued in part that the major questions doctrine does not apply to terrorists because of foreign affairs considerations. Quote, "It seems like they want to carve out this arbitrary exception to major questions for tariffs, even though it can't be justified," end quote, Soman said. For Adler, the bigger picture is that whatever the legal approach the court took, it ruled against Trump in a major case, despite many on the left fretting that would not happen. Quote, "Whether we characterize this as major questions doctrine or not, it's very clear that the court thinks it is important to police the boundaries of what powers Congress has given the executive branch. There were plenty of folks who didn't think that would happen in cases involving the Trump administration," end quote.